The vote was already decided before I finished speaking. I knew it the moment I walked into the chamber and saw the way the Vorith delegates were sitting. Straight-backed, still, with that particular kind of stillness that comes from a group of beings who have already made up their minds, are simply waiting for the formality to end. I had seen that posture before, in rooms far less grand than this one. It never meant anything good. My name is Dara Osei, and I had been Earth's ambassador to the Galactic Council for 11 years. I had sat through trade disputes and border arguments and 3 separate votes on whether humanity should be allowed to expand past a certain orbital boundary. I had watched species twice our size and 10 times our age talk about us the way adults talk about a child who has stumbled into the room. Patient. Condescending. Not yet frightened. That was the detail that always bothered me. Not yet frightened. The chamber itself was enormous. 47 species, each represented by a delegation of 5. The floor was where ambassadors stood when they addressed the full council. There were no chairs on the floor. You stood. You spoke. You were seen by everyone at once. That was the design. That was the point. I walked to the center of the floor, and I did not look at the Vorith section right away. I looked at the Chanteri, who had always been friendly to us, and at the Pel, who were neutral but fair, and at the Ossian Collective, whose opinions shifted like water but who had good memories. Then I looked at the Vorith ambassador. His name was Reth Vono, and he was the kind of politician who smiled exactly as much as he needed to, and not 1 unit more. A tall, green-skinned elder from the Marin species, called the room to order. The matter on the floor was simple, in the way that deeply serious things are often stated simply. which sits along the edge of what Earth considers its shipping lane. A human cargo hauler named the Fairfield had been in that corridor. The Voreth vessel had signaled it to stop, and when the Fairfield's captain, a man named Owen Grant, had requested clarification on the legal basis for the stop, the Voreth vessel had fired a warning shot across the hauler's bow. Owen had stopped. The Voreth had then boarded the Fairfield, removed its cargo manifest data, held the crew for 19 hours, and then let them go. They called it a routine inspection under Council Transit Directive 7. Owen Grant had filed a formal protest within the hour. Earth had filed a formal complaint with the Council within the day. That complaint had been sitting in review for 6 days. Today, instead of a ruling on the complaint, the Council was voting on a package of economic sanctions against Earth. The official reason was that Earth's complaint had been filed in a way that violated procedural guidelines. The real reason was sitting in the Voreth section, still smiling. I had 10 minutes to speak. I used the first 2 minutes on the procedural argument, which I knew I would lose. Then I paused. The chamber was quiet in that way. Large spaces get when everyone in them is paying attention. I said that before I responded to the substance of the vote. I wanted to draw the Council's attention to a document. Not a human document. A Council document. I produced a data chip and held it up so the chamber could see it. I said the document was archived under Council Security Classification 7, which meant it had been sealed for 40 years, and which meant that most of the beings in this room had never read it. I said that I had read it. I said that I thought the Council should consider its contents before proceeding with the vote. I placed the chip on the speaker's floor panel, and the main display at the head of the chamber lit up. The document was called an advisory assessment. It had been written 40 years ago by a Council intelligence analyst named Sova Rel, from the Chanteri species, who had spent 20 years studying Earth. Sova Rel had since passed away, but the assessment remained. I read the relevant section aloud. The human species presents a categorically unique risk profile. They do not expand as conquerors. They expand as settlers. They do not establish dominance as a first move. They establish presence. However, when that presence is threatened, particularly when it is threatened in a manner they perceive as unjust, their response pattern diverges sharply from every other species in the pod. Observed record. They do not retreat. They do not accept symbolic concessions. They escalate, methodically. In every recorded conflict involving a human population, the humans have either achieved their stated objective or have been completely destroyed. There is no middle outcome in the historical record. Under no condition provoke the human species into a state of perceived injustice. The cost of the response will exceed the value of any short-term political gain. I stopped reading. The chamber was still quiet. A different kind of quiet now. I looked at Reth Vano. He was no longer smiling. Not because he was frightened. Because he was calculating. I could see it. He was measuring how much of this would matter to the delegations that hadn't already committed to his coalition. A delegate from the Pell section raised a marker light, requesting to speak. The session chair acknowledged them. The Pell delegate asked if the document I had displayed was authentic, and if so, why it had been classified. I said it was authentic, and that it had been classified at the request of the Vorith delegation at the time it was written. Because even 40 years ago, someone in this chamber understood what the assessment said, and decided it was more convenient to bury it. Several delegations spoke at once. The session chair called for order 3 times before getting it. Reth Vano requested the floor. He was given it. He stood at the center with the ease of someone who had done this many times, and said that the document, whatever its origin, was not relevant to the matter at hand. He said that the human capacity for self-mythology was well documented, and that producing a decades-old internal report was a theatrical gesture designed to distract from a clear procedural violation. He said that the council should not allow emotional appeals to substitute for legal process. He used the phrase, theatrical posturing from a primitive world. He said it calmly, looking not at me but at the Ossian section. I did not respond. I had already said what I needed to say. I picked up my notes from the floor panel, and walked back to the Earth Delegations section, and sat down. My aide, a young man named Calvin Webb, leaned over and asked me in a low voice if I thought any of it had worked. I told him the truth. I said that it didn't matter whether it worked in this room today. What mattered was that the document was now part of the public session record. Every species here had their own recording systems. Every delegation would transmit today's session back to their home governments. In 40 years of sitting sealed in an archive, that assessment had done nothing. In the next 48 hours, it was going to travel to 47 worlds, and 47 governments were going to read those words. They do not retreat. They escalate. Calvin asked what Earth was going to do if the vote passed. I told him to watch. A fine levied against Earth's shipping registry. A human cargo ship. 11 crew members. Impounded by a government that had just been reminded, in writing, that humanity does not accept this kind of thing without a response. I walked out of the chamber into the wide corridor beyond, and I pulled out a small communicator, and I sent a single coded message back to Earth. Not to the diplomatic service, to a different address entirely. The message contained no words, just a timestamp and a confirmation code we had prepared years ago. Calvin caught up to me in the corridor. He was young and smart, and still believed that rooms like the one we had just left were where the real decisions got made. He would learn. I looked at him and I said calmly that he should get some rest. The next few weeks were going to be very long. He asked me why. I said, because someone just made a mistake. And we have been ready for it for a very long time. Through the great chamber doors, the council was already moving on to the next item on the agenda. They had no idea what they had just started. Admiral Keshen of the Vorith Fleet Command did not sleep well the night after the vote. He told himself it was the usual stress of session weeks. The Galactic Council's central station was never a comfortable place to spend time. The air recyclers ran on a setting calibrated for too many species at once, which meant it always smelled faintly wrong regardless of what section you were in. The lighting cycled on a Marin schedule that didn't match Vorith biology. The food was negotiated cuisine, which was to say it was technically edible but not satisfying. He told himself all of this, and he almost believed it. What he couldn't shake was the human ambassador's face when she left the floor. Dara Ose had walked out of that chamber the way you walk out of a meeting you have already won. Not tense, not relieved, not angry. Settled. The way a person looks when the thing they have been waiting for has finally arrived, and they are simply glad the waiting is over. Keshen had been in military command for 22 years. He had learned to pay attention to how people carried their bodies when they thought no one was watching. Dara Ose, walking away from a vote that had gone against her, had carried herself like someone who had just been given permission. Permission for what, exactly, was the question that kept him awake. He was at his desk on the Vorith delegation's assigned station by the 5th hour of the station's artificial morning, reading the traffic reports from the past 72 hours. It was not something an admiral typically did personally. He had staff for that. But he was awake anyway, and reading kept his mind from circling. The traffic reports were, on their surface, unremarkable. Standard cargo movement. Scheduled courier routes. The usual mix of vessels crossing through council-adjacent space on their way to somewhere else. What caught his attention was a pattern of absences. 16 human vessels had been registered in the council's transit tracking system as of 4 days ago. Freighters, mostly, with 2 courier ships and 1 registered science vessel. Today, none of them were showing active transponder signals. Not in transit, not docked, simply not broadcasting. The signals had not cut out simultaneously. They had gone dark over a period of about 18 hours, one by one, at different points across a span of 6 sectors. Each transponder had simply stopped transmitting at the vessel's last logged position, and then nothing. There were ordinary explanations for a transponder going offline. Equipment failure, routine maintenance, a vessel passing through a sector with interference. But 16 vessels across 6 sectors in 18 hours. All going dark in the 24-hour window following the council vote. Keshen flagged the report and sent it to his intelligence officer, a careful and precise woman named Enna Voss, with a note asking for her analysis. Then he pulled up the broader human shipping registry and started cross-referencing. By the 7th hour of the morning cycle, Enna Voss was sitting across from him looking at the same numbers. She said that as far as she could determine, every human-registered vessel currently operating in the 6-sector band adjacent to Vorith space had gone silent. Not just transponders. No scheduled route broadcasts. No port arrival confirmations. No maintenance pings. Nothing. Keshen asked her what she thought it meant. She said, carefully, that she thought it meant they were moving. He asked where. She said she didn't know. That was the point, she thought. If you wanted to move a large number of vessels without anyone tracking them, you turned off everything that could be tracked. Keshen leaned back and looked at the ceiling of his briefing room for a long moment. He thought about what this would look like to the Council's Security Committee, if he brought it there now. He thought about the words he had heard read aloud in the chamber yesterday. They do not retreat. They escalate. He thought about the way he had dismissed those words when Ambassador Vano was dismissing them. He had agreed with Vano in public because that was the position of the Vorith government, and he served the Vorith government. But privately, sitting in the gallery while Dara Ose read that old assessment aloud, something in him had gone very still. He had done what soldiers do with that feeling. He had set it aside. There was a vote to support. The assessment was 40 years old, and had been written by a species with a well-documented tendency toward overcautious analysis. He set it aside. Now, looking at 16 missing ships, he wished he hadn't. He told Enna Voss to expand the search. Not just 6 sectors, everything within 30 transit hours of Voreth primary space. Every human vessel, every registered transponder. He wanted to know exactly how many had gone dark and over what time frame. She came back in less than an hour. 41 vessels, across 11 sectors, all silent. And then, on the 3rd day after the vote, the first installation went dark. Keshen got the report at the 2nd hour of the morning cycle. Transmitting. It was located in a quiet system 3 transit hours from the edge of Voreth primary space. 14 personnel. Standard ore processing. It had been running continuously for 9 years without a significant incident. The message from the outpost simply stopped. No distress call, no warning, no damage report. The transmission stream, which sent automated status updates every 6 minutes, had simply ended mid-cycle. Enna Voss pulled up the last automated status from the outpost. All systems nominal. Power levels stable. No external contacts reported. And then, 6 minutes later, nothing. Keshen dispatched a response vessel immediately. He also sent a quiet alert to Voreth Fleet Command, marked for the attention of the Defense Minister. Not an alarm. Not yet. A notice. He worded it carefully. He said there had been a communications interruption at a mining outpost, and that he was investigating. He did not write what he was actually thinking, which was that communications interruptions that followed a pattern of 41 human vessels going silent in the same week were not routine. On the 4th day, while the response vessel was still en route to extraction point 14, A second installation went dark. This one was larger. A relay station called Echo Junction, which served as a signal routing hub for a cluster of 6 Vorath-administered systems. 90 personnel. Critical infrastructure. It had been operating for 22 years. Same pattern. Transmission stream ended without warning. No distress signal. No damage report. The last automated update from Echo Junction showed all systems nominal. 3 active data streams being routed. 17 ships in transit through the adjacent corridor. Then nothing. Keshen was on a direct call to Vorath Fleet Command within 15 minutes. The defense minister, an older man named Greth Vaughn, who was Reth Vaughno's uncle, and who had been in government for longer than Keshen had been alive, listened to his report without interrupting. When Keshen finished, there was a pause. Greth Vaughn asked if Keshen thought this was the humans. Keshen said he thought the timing made coincidence extremely unlikely. Greth Vaughn asked what the humans could possibly be doing. The council had ruled. The sanctions were in place. The Fairfield was impounded. By every legal standard, the matter was settled. Keshen said, quietly, that he thought the humans did not consider the matter settled. There was another pause. Longer this time. He thought about what Ambassador Osei had said before she left the floor. She hadn't said anything. She had picked up her notes and walked out. And that was the thing about it that he could not stop thinking about. She had walked out of a losing vote looking like she had already moved past it. Not past the disappointment. Past it. Like it was a door she had already opened and walked through. Universe to catch up to where she was standing. Then, on the 5th day, the message arrived. It came through the Council's emergency broadcast frequency, which was reserved for catastrophic events. Using it for anything else was a serious violation of Council protocol. Every delegation's communication system was hardwired to receive emergency frequency broadcasts at full priority. There was no way to mute it, no way to route it to a secondary queue. When something came through on that frequency, every station in the Council network heard it simultaneously. The message was brief. It was written in Vorath script, not in the Galactic Standard language that the Council used for official communication. In Vorath, which meant it had been written specifically for them. It said, 1 colony ship seized, 2 installations. We are keeping score. That was all. No sender listed. No demands. No ultimatum. No signature. Keshen read it 3 times. He was sitting in his briefing room when it came through, and he read it on his display, and then he set the display face down on the table, and sat very still for a moment, because he understood something now that he had not fully understood before. an action taken in reply to the vote. He had been modeling it in his mind the way you model a reaction, looking for the logic of proportional return. One ship impounded, so two installations targeted. An escalating exchange. The humans hadn't gone silent after the vote and then started moving. They had been moving before the vote. The 41 vessels had gone dark over an 18-hour window that had started before the final vote count was announced, which meant the decision to act had been made before the result was official, which meant the result didn't matter. The vote itself, the moment the council took an action against a human ship and its crew, was the trigger. Not the outcome of the vote. The act. They hadn't reacted to losing. They had been ready before anyone in that chamber knew what was about to happen. Keshen picked up his communicator and called Enna Voss. He told her he needed a full accounting of every Vorath installation, relay point, fuel depot, transit hub, and communications node, within 15 transit hours of any known human shipping lane. She asked why. He said because he needed to know what else they could lose, and he needed to know it before it was gone. Enna Voss was quiet for a moment. Then she said she would start immediately. Her voice was steady, which he respected, but he could hear, underneath the steadiness, that she had read the message too. That she had done the same math he had done. They had not been watching the right things. And somewhere out in the dark between the stars, 41 ships with no transponders were still moving, and he had absolutely no idea where any of them were going. I sat in the briefing room on the 14th floor of Earth's Strategic Command Building, in Nairobi, and I listened to General Petra Hollis explain to me what my government had been doing for the past 12 years without my knowledge. I want to be clear that I was not angry. I had been a diplomat long enough to know that governments keep things from their own people, not out of malice, but out of necessity. You cannot protect a contingency plan by announcing it. You cannot maintain a deterrent by explaining it. I understood this. I had spent 11 years watching other governments operate exactly this way. But sitting in that room, looking at the display screens that General Hollis was walking me through, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time in my professional life. I felt humbled. The general was a compact woman in her late 50s with short gray hair, and the kind of posture that comes from decades of physical discipline. She spoke the way people speak when they have explained something many times, and have learned exactly which words are necessary and which are not. She was not unkind. She was precise. She began with the timeline. 12 years ago, following a series of incidents in the outer transit corridors that had not reached the level of formal complaint, but had been carefully catalogued by Earth's monitoring services, a working group had been convened. Its mandate was to answer a specific question. If the Galactic Council ever took a formally hostile action against a human vessel or installation, what would Earth's options be? I asked what kind of hostile action they had anticipated. She said they had anticipated exactly what happened. A seizure. A vessel stopped, held, and formally impounded under the cover of procedural authority. A move that was technically legal under Council charter language, that would be difficult to contest through formal channels, and that was designed to establish a precedent, that if the Council could take your ship without real consequence, the Council could take anything. She said the working group had reached a consensus within 6 months. And that response had to be disproportionately costly to the party that had acted, without triggering a full military confrontation that would give the Council legal grounds to classify Earth as an aggressor. She turned to the main display and showed me a map. It covered 11 sectors of Council-adjacent space. Scattered across it, marked in quiet blue points, were 40 locations. Some were labeled as shipping waypoints. Some were labeled as science survey coordinates. A few were labeled with code designations I didn't recognize. Most of them were in Vorith-influenced space. But not all. Several were in systems belonging to species that had voted with Vorith in the sanction package. She said those were the positions of Earth's pre-deployed assets. She said that over the course of 12 years, mixed into normal shipping traffic, maintenance runs and survey missions, Earth had quietly positioned 40 operational units across 11 sectors. Each unit was self-contained, independently powered, and capable of disrupting the function of any nearby infrastructure installation, without causing permanent damage or physical harm to personnel. I looked at the map for a long time. I asked her what disrupting the function meant specifically. She said it meant making things stop working. Power systems, transmission arrays, processing equipment. Not destroyed, shut down. Eventually, be repaired, but not quickly, and not without significant cost. I asked if anyone had been hurt at the 2 installations that had already gone dark. She said no. She said that was a hard constraint built into every unit's operating parameters. No personnel casualties. Not under any circumstances. The goal was to impose economic and operational cost, not to harm people. I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked her the question that had been forming since I walked into the room. I asked why. If Earth had spent 12 years preparing this, we had never used it before. There had been other incidents. Other provocations. The border restrictions of 7 years ago. The tariff manipulation 4 years before that. Why now, and not then? General Hollis looked at me with an expression that was not quite a smile but contained the elements of one. She said, "Because we didn't need to then. Those incidents were costly, but they were reversible through diplomatic channels. What happened to the Fairfield was different. Owen Grant and his crew were held for 19 hours without legal basis, in violation of their rights under Council Charter, and the Council's response to our complaint was not to address the violation, but to punish us for filing it." She said that crossed a line that the 12-year plan had been designed for. Not a line of severity, a line of intent. With the Council's support, had decided that human vessels and human crews could be treated as political tools. That was the line. I asked what happened next. She said that the Council had already sent a diplomatic signal requesting a conversation. Earth had responded that the conversation could happen after the Fairfield and its crew were returned. The council had acknowledged the response and asked for time to deliberate. She said that while the council was deliberating, 2 more assets had been activated: a fuel depot in the Vorith secondary supply chain, and a signal relay hub that served 3 systems whose governments had co-signed the sanction package. Neither installation had been harmed permanently. Both were currently offline. I thought about what it must look like from the council's side. You impose a sanction expecting the usual response. Protest, complaint, formal appeal, maybe a small show of fleet presence in a nearby sector. You expect the kind of resistance that fits within the framework you have set, because the framework is yours and you built it to favor yourself. And instead, nothing happens for a day. And then another day. And then your installations start going dark one at a time, quietly, without announcement, without any message from the humans at all. It is a statement of arithmetic. They were keeping score. I understood then what the archived assessment had actually been documenting. It hadn't been documenting human aggression. It hadn't been documenting human aggression. It had been documenting something far more specific and far more unsettling to a political body like the Council. It had been documenting human patience. Every other species in the Council's history had responded to provocation in ways the Council could predict and manage. You push, they push back. You negotiate from the new position. You reach a settlement that everyone can live with, and that quietly establishes who has more leverage. And the Council was fluent in it. Humanity didn't speak that language. Or rather, humanity spoke it perfectly well when the situation called for it. But when a situation crossed a certain threshold, we switched to a different language entirely. One that had no vocabulary for compromise mid-action. One where the only conversation was after the objective was achieved. General Hollis pulled up a second display. This one showed the current status of all 40 assets. 36 were still dormant. 4 were active. She walked me through the activation logic. Assets would continue to come online at irregular intervals, targeting installations that caused maximum operational disruption at minimum humanitarian cost, until the Fairfield was released. After the Fairfield was released, all assets would return to dormant status. They would remain in place. They would remain operational. But they would go quiet. She said that last part carefully, and I caught the significance of it. They would go quiet, not be removed, not be deactivated. Quiet. I asked if the council would know that. She said, not officially. But they would suspect. And suspicion, in this case, was the point. I asked Calvin Webb, who had accompanied me to the briefing, to get us both something to eat, because I knew we were going to be in this room for several more hours, and I could feel the particular kind of tired that comes not from lack of sleep, but from processing too many large things at once. After he left, I sat with General Hollis in the briefing room, just the two of us, and I asked her honestly if she thought this was going to work. She said she thought the question was already slightly out of date. She said the question of whether it was going to work assumed there was still a turning point at which it might not. She believed that point had passed. The Council's coalition was fracturing. 3 of the species that had co-signed the sanction package had already begun quiet back-channel communications with Earth's diplomatic office. Not official contact. Unofficial. The kind of contact that means a government is looking for a way to not be associated with a decision that is turning out to be more expensive than advertised. She said that governments and coalitions always have a threshold for how much shared cost they are willing to carry. Vorith had pulled people into this expecting it to cost nothing. The moment it started costing something, the coalition became a liability, not an asset. I thought about Rethvano in the council chamber, dismissing the old assessment with that particular kind of confidence that comes from never having been wrong in a way that mattered yet. I thought about what he was dealing with right now. His coalition shrinking, his installations dark, an enemy that had not said a single hostile word, had not moved a single visible warship, and was still somehow making him pay. I asked General Hollis one more question. I asked her what the freighters were doing. She looked at me for a moment. Then she smiled, fully this time, and said that was a very good question, and that the answer was that they were doing exactly what they had always been doing. Moving goods, running routes, being freighters. Every single one of them. The 41 ships that had gone dark had done so to provide cover, to make Keshan and his intelligence staff look in 11 sectors at once, to make the disappearance of 41 vessels feel like the threat, feel like the action being taken, so that no one would think to look at what was actually happening. waking up one at a time. I sat back in my chair and I looked at the ceiling of the briefing room. Outside, through the window, Nairobi was moving through its evening in the ordinary way that cities do. Traffic, lights coming on, people going home. I thought about Owen Grant on the Fairfield, who had asked a legal question about the authority of the vessel stopping him, and had gotten 19 hours of detention as the answer. I thought about his crew. I thought about the fact that somewhere in a Vorath-controlled port facility right now, 11 human beings were being held, officially pending review, which everyone involved knew was a way of saying, until we decide what you are worth, to us as a bargaining piece. Admiral Keshen had not slept in 36 hours. And he was not going to apologize for it. He sat at the head of the conference table in the Vorath Fleet Command emergency session room, and he looked at the faces of the people around him, and he tried to determine which ones actually understood what was happening, and which ones were still working, from a model of events that no longer applied. The emergency session had been called by Defense Minister Greth Vaughn, who was sitting to Keshen's right, with the expression of a man who has recently been given information that conflicts deeply with his understanding of the world, and is taking some time to process it. To his left was Admiral Preth Saul, who commanded the Vorath Home Defense Fleet, and who had the advantage of being unambiguous about his position. Preth Saul believed that the correct response to what the humans were doing was to send a fleet into human-adjacent space, and announce that any further interference with Vorath installations would be treated as an act of war. Keshen had been arguing against this position for the past 2 hours. The problem with Preth Saul's position was not that it lacked logic. In a conventional situation, threatening a proportional military response to economic sabotage was a reasonable move. You demonstrated that your threshold for escalation was low, which made the cost of further provocation too high, which encouraged the other party to stop. The problem was that this was not a conventional situation, and Keshen had spent the past 4 days arriving at a very uncomfortable understanding of why. He pulled up the current status board and turned it so the table could see it. 6 installations now offline. 2 mining outposts, 1 relay station, 1 fuel depot, 1 transit coordination hub, and a supply processing facility. The supply processing facility had gone dark 6 hours ago without warning, following the same pattern as the others. No personnel harmed. No physical damage visible from the outside, simply stopped working, as if someone had reached in and turned off a switch. The combined operational cost of what was currently offline was significant. The combined operational cost of what would be offline if the pattern continued was very large. He said that to the room, plainly. He said that the pattern had not slowed, had not paused, had not given any indication of stopping. He said that whoever was responsible for these events was not operating with a list of 3 targets or 5 targets. They were operating with a list, and the list was longer than 6. Preth Saul said that was exactly why they needed to respond with force, show the humans that interference with Vorath infrastructure had military consequences. Keshen asked him how, specifically, he intended to do that. The humans had not sent any vessels into Vorith space. There were no human warships at the border. There was no military formation to respond to. He asked Preth Sol where he was going to point his fleet. Preth Sol said they could move into human-adjacent space and make clear that further action would result in engagement. Keshen said he had 3 concerns with that. The first was that if Vorith moved a fleet into human-adjacent space, it transformed the legal character of the situation. Currently, Earth was conducting economic disruption operations. Covert, targeted, non-lethal. The Council's legal committee had been reviewing the situation for 2 days, and their preliminary finding was that it was difficult to classify under existing charter definitions. It was not an attack. It was not a declared conflict. It was something the charter had not anticipated. Moving a Vorith fleet into human-adjacent space would give Earth's legal team exactly the trigger they needed to redefine everything as defensive action. The second was intelligence. He said that he had ordered a full accounting of every Vorith installation within 15 transit hours of 2 human shipping lanes. The number was larger than he was comfortable with, and he had no way of knowing, none at all, how many of those installations were already adjacent to one of the human units that was still dormant. Moving a fleet would not address the units already in place. It would just tell the humans that the fleet was coming. The third was the simplest and the most important. He said he had read the archived assessment that Ambassador Osei had put into the public session record. All of it, not just the summary. Sova Rel had included a supplemental analysis that was not read aloud in the chamber. He pulled it up on the display. It said, "In every observed historical case of human military engagement, the humans have demonstrated a consistent pattern of pre-conflict preparation that significantly exceeds observed norms for the species' technological level. Their strategy is not reactive. It is anticipatory. They do not build responses to threats. They build responses to threat categories, and then wait for specific instances to activate them." The human species may have active contingency preparations for scenarios that have not yet occurred. Attempting to deter a human response after the response has been initiated may therefore be analogous to attempting to catch an object that has already been dropped. Keshen let the room read it. Then he said quietly that he believed they were already in the middle of something that had been planned before the vote. He believed the decision tree that Earth was executing had been built years ago, and they were simply moving through it now, one branch at a time, and the only variable that mattered was whether Vorith gave them a reason to move faster. Sending a fleet would give them that reason. Greth Vaughn, who had been silent for the past 15 minutes, spoke for the first time. He asked Keshen what he thought they should do. Keshen said he thought they should return the Fairfield. The room was quiet for a moment. Preth Sol said that was capitulation. He said that returning the ship without any concession was a signal to every species in the council that Vorith could be pressured into backing down. He said the political cost was unacceptable. Keshen said he understood that concern. He said he also understood that the political cost of a Vorith fleet moving into position the fleet had no legal target to engage would be significantly worse. He said you cannot project strength from a position where the other party has already moved around you. He paused and then said something he had been holding back. He said that 2 of the species that had co-signed the sanction package had quietly withdrawn their diplomatic support in the past 24 hours. He had received that information from a contact in the Council's General Affairs Office. They had not made public announcements. They had simply stopped attending the Vorith Coalition briefings. He said that the coalition that had made the vote possible was already coming forward. A position that was costing Vorith something, and costing them, indirectly, something too. Greth Vaughn asked how the ship would be returned without it looking like exactly what Preth Saul said it was. Keshen said it would be filed as a procedural resolution. The impound review had been completed. No violations found. Ship cleared for release under standard processing. No statement. No ceremony. Just a filing. He said the humans would know what it meant. He said every species in the council would know what it meant. But knowing what something means and having it officially mean something are different things, and governments everywhere in the galaxy had been navigating that distinction since politics was invented. The room argued for another hour. Preth Saul did not give up his position easily, and Keshen did not expect him to. But Greth Vaughn was listening with the careful attention of a man doing math, and eventually the math came out the same way it always came out, when you were honest about what you were counting. 6 installations offline. Coalition fracturing. No military target to engage. and showing no sign of stopping. The Fairfield was released the next morning. The processing system logged a routine completion of impound review. No statement was issued. The captain, Owen Grant, received a notification from Vorith Port Authority that his vessel had been cleared for departure, and that his crew should present themselves at Docking Bay 11 before the third morning hour. Owen Grant, by all accounts, read the notification, said nothing in particular, and then walked down to Docking Bay 11 with his crew and flew home. The Vorith response to the release came through the standard diplomatic channel the next day. Formal and correct, nothing more. Earth's response came through the Council's emergency broadcast frequency. The same frequency the previous message had used. The same frequency reserved for catastrophic events. Now used for the second time in 1 week. For something that was not a catastrophe in the traditional sense. The message was a single word, transmitted to every delegation in the Council network simultaneously. Not in Vorith script this time. In Galactic Standard, so that everyone heard it equally. Noted. Keshen read it at his desk in the early hours of the station's morning cycle. He read it once, and set down his communicator. He thought about what it meant that the message was one word. It meant that Earth did not feel the need to say more. It meant the matter was recorded, understood. And they were acknowledging that without surprise or celebration. He thought about the 34 assets that were presumably still out there, still in place, still dormant. He thought about the archived assessment. The response has not concluded. It has paused. He had not read that line before because it had not been in the section Dara Ose read aloud. It was in the supplemental notes that most people had not looked at closely. He pulled it up and read it again. It is critical to understand that a pause in human response activity is not a cessation. Once a human strategic response has been initiated, it does not end until the human-defined objective has been achieved. What looks like de-escalation from the outside is frequently a hold state, waiting for verification that the objective condition has been met. Do not mistake quiet for resolution. Keshen turned off his display. Outside the station's observation port, the stars were where they had always been. Everything looked exactly as it had before any of this started. It would continue to look that way for a long time. He was not comforted by this. I stood at the center of the council chamber floor for the second time in 3 weeks. And this time the room felt different. It was not that the delegates were seated differently, or that the chamber had changed its layout. It was the silence before I began speaking. The first time I had stood here, the silence was the silence of a group of people who were waiting for a performance to end. They had already voted. They were listening as a courtesy. They expected nothing surprising. This silence was different. This was the silence of 47 delegations that had, in the past 3 weeks, received transmissions from their home governments, asking pointed questions about the current situation, and had spent the intervening days not finding good answers. I had slept well the night before. Calvin Webb had made sure I ate a real meal before the session. I had spoken with Owen Grant by comm the morning he arrived back on Earth. A brief conversation. Because he was a man who did not have much patience for long conversations. And what he said in short ones was usually enough. He had said he was glad to be home, and that his crew was all right. I had said I was glad to hear it. He had said, I figured you'd have something planned. And I said that we had, and he said, good, and that was the end of it. I stood on the floor of the council chamber and I began to speak. I said I was not going to discuss the events of the past 3 weeks in detail. I said the council had access to all the relevant records and did not need me to narrate them. I said what I wanted to talk about instead was something more fundamental, because I thought the past 3 weeks had revealed a misunderstanding that, if not addressed, would simply lead to this situation recurring. I said the misunderstanding was this. Many species in this chamber, and many governments across the council's membership, had formed a picture of humanity over the years that was not entirely accurate. The picture showed a young species, technologically capable but politically immature, that could be managed through the normal instruments of galactic governance. Economic levers. The slow accumulation of favorable precedents. That picture was not completely wrong. We were a young species. We were still learning the language of this kind of politics. There were things about how the council operated that we found difficult, and things we found confusing, and things we found genuinely unjust. But the picture was missing something. Something that the council's own intelligence analyst had documented 40 years ago, and that this chamber had voted, at Voreth's request, to seal in an archive. I said that the missing thing was not aggression. I wanted to be precise about that, because I thought it mattered. Humanity's historical record looked aggressive from the outside because it involved a great deal of conflict. But the record, examined carefully, showed something different. We had fought many wars. We had started very few of them. The conflicts in our history almost always followed the same basic structure. Someone pushed. We did not immediately push back. We held. We waited. We prepared. And then, when we moved all the way to the end. The willingness to wait until we were ready, and then not stop until it was done. I said that understanding this was important, because it meant that the question the council should be asking about humanity was not, how do we manage this species? The question should be, how do we build a relationship that doesn't require management at all? I said I had a proposal. I outlined it plainly. A revised trade agreement that gave human vessels equal standing in the transit corridors, with clear legal definitions of what constituted an authorized stop and what did not. A formal review mechanism for disputes, with a neutral arbitration panel, so that complaints did not get buried in procedural delays, and a standing agreement that any detention of human crew members in the future, before the completion of a formal legal process, would be treated as a violation triggering automatic review. I said these were not dramatic demands. They were the things that any species of comparable standing would consider standard. I said we were not asking for special treatment. We were asking for the treatment that the Council's own charter guaranteed, and that had not, in practice, been applied to us equally. I said the Council had 48 hours to respond, not because I was setting a deadline as a threat, but because I believed 48 hours was a reasonable amount of time for governments to make decisions when they had already had 3 weeks to think about the situation. Then I said one more thing. I said I wanted to address a question that I expected was on the mind of several delegations. The question of what had happened over the past 3 weeks, and whether the events represented an ongoing posture that the Council should be worried about. I said I could not speak to the specifics of every event. I said that would be outside my authority. What I could say was this: humanity's response to the seizure of the Fairfield had been proportional, targeted, and limited in scope. No permanent damage had been done. Every installation that had gone offline was, to the best of my understanding, repairable. I said that our response had concluded when our vessel and crew were returned. I said that was the end of the matter. As far as Earth was concerned, I said the 34 installations that had not been affected should remain fully operational going forward, provided the Council moved toward the revised agreement in good faith. I said the word 34, clearly, and without emphasis. I did not look at Rethvano when I said it. I looked at the Chanteri section, which was where the neutral and observant delegations tended to cluster, and I let the number sit in the room. 34. A number that implied I knew exactly how many there had been of something, and exactly how many remained. A number that implied a count. I did not confirm that any specific assets existed. I did not threaten anything. And let the Council's collective imagination supply the rest. After I finished speaking, Rethvano requested the floor. He was given it. He stood at the center and spoke for 5 minutes in measured and correct galactic standard about the Council's commitment to fair process and the importance of constructive engagement between all member species. He said the Vorith government looked forward to reviewing the proposed agreement in detail. He said he was confident the Council would reach a resolution that served all parties. He did not mention the past 3 weeks. He did not mention the Fairfield. He did not mention the 6 installations. He simply looked forward and spoke about the future in the language of someone who has decided that the recent past is a room he would prefer to walk out of as quickly as possible. That told me everything I needed to know about how the next 48 hours were going to go. It took 31 hours. The agreement was signed by 38 of the 47 member species, which was the largest margin of any trade and transit agreement in Council history. Several species that had co-signed the sanction package signed it, which required a certain amount of institutional willingness to move past recent events, and which I thought spoke well of their pragmatism. Calvin Webb, when he saw the final count, looked at me and said that he hadn't expected it to be that many. I told him that was because he had been expecting the council to fight for their position. And governments fight for positions when fighting costs less than giving ground. Once the math changes, position holding becomes expensive, and expensive things get abandoned faster than anyone expects. He nodded slowly, working through it. As the delegations were dispersing into the wide corridor beyond the chamber, the Vorith ambassador passed close enough to me to speak without broadcasting to the room. Reth Vano stopped. He looked at me with an expression I had not seen on his face before. Not calculation. Not performance. Something quieter. In a low voice, how Earth had deployed assets in Council-adjacent space for 12 years without any intelligence service detecting them. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said that we had done it the same way we had been moving cargo through these corridors since we first joined the Council. On freighters. Slow, ordinary, unremarkable freighters that no one paid close attention to. Watched warships, he said. We were watching your military vessels. And then he walked away. No further comment. No goodbye. Just a man in a corridor moving toward whatever came next, carrying the particular weight of having been very confident about something that turned out to be entirely wrong. I watched him go. Calvin Webb appeared at my elbow and asked if I was ready to head back. I said yes. I said let's go home. We walked out of the council station and back toward the transit dock. And I thought about something General Hollis had said to me in the briefing room in Nairobi. She had said that the 34 dormant assets would remain in place. Quiet, but in place. And I had asked if the council would know that. She had said they would suspect. I thought that was probably the most accurate description of the relationship we had now established with the Galactic Council. They would not know. They would look at every unremarkable freighter in every transit corridor, and they would wonder. They would look at every quiet shipping route, and they would recalculate. They would not provoke a human vessel again without knowing, fully and clearly, that they did not know what was parked quietly in the nearest sector, waiting to be needed. Not dominance, just the knowledge, carried at the back of the mind the way important knowledge tends to be carried, that the math of provoking humanity had changed. The treaty sat in the Council's formal record, the agreement was real, and the terms were fair, and I believed most of the signatories intended to honor them. And in a building on the Vorath home station that processed routine Council intelligence documents, a junior analyst added one line to the bottom of Sova Rel's archived assessment. No clearance level noted. No authorization stamp. Just a line, added quietly by someone who had watched the past 3 weeks from a distance, and apparently felt the document needed updating. They heeded nothing. We will not make that mistake again. I did not know about that line until much later. When I read it, I thought Sova Rel, wherever she was, would have found it fitting. Not as a warning, as a conclusion.